Hi all, it's me, Allison. This summer has been the summer for highly anticipated reads. In the month of May alone, I had 5 new releases, 3 of which were released on the exact same day. Needless to say, I've been reading to my little heart's content. So today I'm going to be sharing with you all of my thoughts of all of the summer reads I've read thus far, what lived up to the hype, what surprised me, and what fell a little bit flat. Let's get into it. So starting out with one of my most anticipated reads of this summer, Shield of Sparrows by Devney Perry. Now, if you've been watching my channel, watched maybe a singular video that I've created, you will know that I am a huge Devney Perry fan. The thing about Devney is that she usually writes like contemporary romance, more specifically like cowboy romances in Montana. That's usually her MO. But this year she decided to dip her toes into fantasy, and let me tell you, she delivered. So in this book, our main female character, Odessa, is kind of living in the shadow of her younger half-sister, May. May was chosen by her father to become the sparrow for their kingdom. Now, what is a sparrow, you may ask? So in this world, the surrounding kingdoms offer up a princess to marry a prince from a separate kingdom as a way to keep the peace within these territories. So basically, May was raised to become the queen of another territory. In this world, all of these kingdoms are plagued with horrible, horrible monsters that were created by the gods of this world. They're getting harder and harder to fight/ignore. Every few years or so, they have this thing called the crux migration, which the crux are basically unbeatable, indestructible monsters that literally destroy everything in their path. And when we get into this book, you are kind of under the impression that the crux migration is coming soon. But let's get back to Odessa. Odessa was basically trained to be a fly on the wall, invisible. She's always dressed in drab clothing and is the one sister that they're trying to keep out of trouble. Unfortunately, she just can't do that. So when the book starts, you see that her father has called in her sister's betrothed and their kingdom to come and slay these water monsters that are kind of plaguing their waters right now. This is actually the first time that May and or Odessa are exposed to May's betrothal. You find out that Prince Xavier from Tura, I think that's how you say it. I've been saying it Tura in my head, so the kingdom of Tura, he comes in and he actually does not speak, believe it or not. And so he kind of speaks through this person who is notorious around the kingdom, who they call the Guardian. The Guardian has superhuman strength. It's kind of a lethal weapon for their kingdom. And the thing about Tura is that they are very secretive. Their capital city is actually a secret to the surrounding kingdoms. And Odessa's father is trying to get access to that capital as well as try and kill the Guardian. So, not only was May chosen to become the sparrow as a treaty bargaining chip, she was also trained as a spy in order to go in and disrupt the kingdom as we know it. Unfortunately, those plans do go a little to the wayside because Prince Xavier and his soldiers defeated these kraken-type monsters for Odessa's father's kingdom. He sparked a treaty in which he is owed basically a wife. As we've said, he is already betrothed to May, but he decides that he actually wants to marry Odessa instead, and there's nothing that her father can do about it. This is when Odessa finds out that May is indeed being trained to be a spy, and she had a probably 24-hour crash course on her objectives and what she needs to do once she gets into the kingdom of Tura. So from there, we're going on this journey in which she is traveling to her new homeland. As she's trying to get to know her husband-to-be, she's also finding herself having a lot of tension and butting heads with said Guardian. So once she gets to Tura, it's where all of these like secrets come out. I don't want to say too much because there were a lot of twists and turns within this novel, and I don't want to spoil that, obviously. I will say that it was very slow. The romance did not pick up until 75%, and up until 50%, it was a very like monotonous plot. But that does not mean the book was not good, okay? The book was phenomenal. I was very thoroughly impressed with Devney Perry's dip into the romantasy space. I think that she did a really good job of not taking bits and pieces from existing fantasy storylines and mashing it together. I feel like it is very hard to read fantasy nowadays because all of them start to kind of run together and have similar stories and similar like themes that kind of get old when you see them over and over again. I found her story building very refreshing, like something I've never read before, which I found really exciting. But I wouldn't consider this a romantasy like just yet. The romance wasn't anything to write home about, unfortunately. I did enjoy it, but it just felt like it wasn't the main focus of this book. This book was more plot driven more than anything, which is totally fine. Completely love that. And I can see where the next one will focus more on romance than this one did. I felt like the romance kind of fell flat, if I'm gonna be honest, but maybe we just don't know the whole story yet. All I have to say is that it was really good. I ended up giving it 4 stars. I would highly recommend Shield of Sparrows. Okay, so this next one makes me a tad emotional. It is Rewind It Back by Liz Tomforde, which is the 5th and last book in the Windy City series, which all of you are fully aware I'm completely obsessed with. It was a very bittersweet read, we'll just say that. Seeing this story and these characters kind of come to an end was very sad for me. This book is centered around Rio DeLuca, who is a hockey player that we met in the first book, Mile High, and have seen grow throughout the entire series. So this was obviously very anticipated because he's the one character we know the most about, basically. And usually Rio is that type of character who's like the comedic relief, and so this was fun to see him kind of shine and see him in a different light. In this book, Rio is looking for an interior designer to help spruce up his home just in case he ends up getting drafted back home and has to sell his home. He wants to sell it for a good price, things like that. So he ends up hiring the interior designer that his neighbor used, and it turns out that it was actually his ex-girlfriend from high school who he has not gotten over since high school. It's clear from the very beginning of this book that Hallie and Rio definitely have some issues with each other despite their history, and Rio finds it really hard to work with Hallie because of these issues of a mysterious incident that happened when they were children. Unfortunately for Hallie, this is a big opportunity to remodel this home for a pretty well-known name in the city of Chicago. She's hoping that this will catapult her career with this very famous interior designer that she is interning for. So despite them having issues, they do move forward with remodeling the home together, and that's when you start getting the flashbacks of them when they were children and when they started dating, and you go back and forth between the past and the present. Clearly, they slowly but surely start to fall back in love with each other and heal from past incidents. This ending to this series was very bittersweet, and I'm glad that we got to see Rio's story. Unfortunately, I felt the least connected to this book. I just could not put myself into the world like I usually can. I thought that I would be really connected with Rio, but I just didn't feel that between him and Hallie. It wasn't a bad book per se, it just did not exceed the expectations that I was expecting. I fear that this was definitely the weakest book in the series. I did not feel nary a butterfly in my tummy the entire time I was reading it. I thought the story was pretty sweet, but once again, it really wasn't that original. This was like every other childhood second chance romance books that I've ever read, and I felt like their resolution with their conflicts were just flat. And I thought that the whole entire reason that they have beef in the first place was very stupid, no offense. Personally, I thought it was going to be hard to follow up, play along the book before this because Isaiah was perfect in every single way. And this was just a tough look for Rio. It's not his fault he came after Isaiah. I felt like we could have just gone without this book and we could have ended with Isaiah, unfortunately. Nevertheless, I did enjoy myself and I did end up giving it 4 stars. I love seeing those characters that I love so much, but unfortunately it just didn't do it for me. Speaking of hockey romance, Chelsea Curto did drop what she claims to be the hottest book she's ever released to date, Hat Trick. I was highly anticipating this book because not only is our male main character a hot hockey player who wears glasses, who's a golden retriever, who ends up losing his leg, but the physical therapist of the team helps him rehab. I love a comeback story. I love an underdog. I love a sweet man with a feisty woman. And this was the recipe that we were given. And not only were we following Lexi and Riley throughout the other books, this was his time to shine, so I was very excited to read it. This is also the 4th book in the DC Stars series, which I have been completely in love with. I've read all of the other ones, and you know how much I love an interconnected series. After all of the hype leading up to this book, after finishing it, I did just find it kind of like meh. It felt very repetitive from the first book. I feel like Riley was basically copy-paste of Maverick, who is the main male character in the first book, Face Off. There were very similar traits / scenes that she recycled in this book. For example, in the first book, Maverick carries around olives in his pocket because Emmy loves to have olives in her drinks. In Hat Trick, Riley does the same thing with limes because Lexi likes limes in her drink. There's also a scene in the first book, Face Off, where Maverick basically busts down Emmy's door because she's so sick that she cannot get out of bed and he takes care of her. Riley does basically the exact same thing with Lexi. Unfortunately, he does not break down Lexi's door, but they do have a very similar scene that was almost identical to book 1. On top of all that, like the main part of the whole book was that they were friends with benefits, which is exactly what Emmy and Maverick were in book 1. So it just felt very like Maverick 2.0, but like he lost a leg. I will say there were obviously certain points in this book that very much focused on losing a limb and the emotions and the process of recovery with that, which I found very interesting. I feel like there's not a lot of books out there that cover these topics, so I thought that was very interesting. But unfortunately, it just didn't do it for me. All it was basically a lot of smut, which I'm not really privy to anymore. I need a storyline, I need romance. So I gave this one, I think it was 3, but I was really tempted to give it a 2.75, but I could not do it just because of how great the group chat is for these hockey players. If Chelsea Curto can do anything, she can do a text thread. That was the most enjoyable part of this whole book, was the group chat of all of the hockey boys on the team. They are completely hilarious. And now that we've gotten to know 3 out of the 8 that are there, it's very fun to see them interact and keep bringing you back to their stories, even though we're not in their books anymore. Now, we all know that this is an Emily Henry house, so naturally I was super excited to jump into her new book, Great Big Beautiful Life, until I saw all of the horrible reviews, and that completely delayed me jumping face first into the book the second it came out. I reluctantly decided I was going to listen to it on audio because if books aren't that great, usually the audio tends to help me enjoy it more. And the one complaint I saw about this book is that it was so slow, and I think when you listen to it, it can be easier to handle with a slow burn. So I jumped into the audiobook, and I have to say I actually wasn't disappointed. Now, I wouldn't say that this is exactly her best book she's ever written, but it definitely wasn't her worst. I'm looking at you, book lovers. I actually found myself enjoying it a lot more than I was anticipating. In true Emily Henry fashion, this book centers around 2 authors who are competing against each other for the opportunity to write a biography about notorious socialite Margaret Ives. Alice is an optimistic celebrity journalist who is just hoping to get her big break. And then there's Hayden, who is a Pulitzer Prize winning, somewhat grumpy journalist. They are both offered a 1-month trial in which they both get to sit down with Margaret and hear her story and come up with a draft in which she can choose from to pick who is going to be the author of this biography, basically. Throughout this journey, Alice and Hayden are slowly starting to fall in love, while we also get to hear the story of Margaret's life growing up. We go through her traumatic, happy, and mundane moments in her life. So in this book, the chapters kind of go back and forth between like going in the past to learn about Margaret and then the present, where we're seeing Hayden and Alice start to fall in love with each other. It was very interesting, and I felt like the back and forth helped keep the story feel fresh. And I actually really did enjoy Margaret's story. I know a lot of people found her story pretty boring and didn't really care for her chapters, but I was actually really excited to hear more about her and why she's so notorious and her husband that died and things like that. So it was very interesting to me personally. I will say though that this book didn't really focus on Alice and Hayden as much as it focused on Margaret, and so I can see why some people were disappointed in the book because it wasn't very romantic per se. Obviously there was romance, but it wasn't the main plot of this story, which is kind of like her MO. Usually this was definitely a different type of read for Emily Henry, but I didn't hate it. I did end up giving it 3 stars just because it was a little slow in getting into it, but I did enjoy myself. And I will say though, if you are interested in reading it, I would suggest doing the audiobook just because I felt like the audiobook was done really well. And once again, I've had people tell me that they enjoyed it more through the audio than actually physically reading it. Up next, we have just another Boys of Tommen book that completely wrecked all of my emotions. Releasing 10 by Chloe Walsh is the 6th book in the Boys of Tommen series, which is centered around 2 characters that we really haven't seen a lot about in the other books. Obviously they are there, but we're not really sure about the storyline, so this was exciting to hop into somebody else's storyline for a change. So in this book, we're centered around Huey and Liz. While reading the other books in this series, you can tell that Liz and Huey have this underlying tension and you're not sure where it's coming from. And this book very much explained the extent of their friendship slash relationship. I can't really explain my thoughts on this book without completely spoiling the other books. So if you are intending on reading the Boys of Tommen books at any point, I need you to go ahead and skip to the next chapter. Okay, now that all the Boys of Tommen fans are here, let's talk. I'll be honest, going into this book, I wasn't that excited to read it just because, as we've seen in the past, Liz can be a very trifling and very hard character to love. It is implied obviously in the other books that she's had some mental illness issues in the past as far as grief and trauma and maybe some other things that we're not aware of that we do become aware of in this new book. I wasn't very excited, but I do have an interest in Huey specifically, so I was going into this with no expectations basically. I also want to preface that this book was almost 800 pages for a contemporary romance, which is absolutely absurd. And after reading the almost 800 pages, I don't even think you could consider this book a romance per se. So when I say that this book was extremely boring and extremely traumatizing up until 50% of the book, I mean that with my whole chest. So keep in mind, if this book is almost 800 pages and 50% of it is boring, I read 400 pages of literal nonsense. Within those 400 pages, you see these characters that we've grown to love go from age 5 to age 14, 15-ish. There is a bit of an age gap between Liz and Hugh, but in Liz's case, she starts off at 5 and we get to like where she's 14 by the 50% mark. It was a very tough read up until that point just because there are very traumatic things that happen to Liz as she's a child that has triggered some mental illness situations as she's growing up. I will say I found it very hard to read such young, innocent characters go through some pretty like horrible scenarios such as death, loss, but specifically Liz's bipolar mental illness that has been plaguing her since she was a child. Liz from an early age did show some symptoms of bipolar, which created a bit of a strain between her father and her sister. So her growing up, she didn't really have the best support system, which is where Huey comes in and he becomes her support system throughout these formative years. Once they get old enough to understand hormones and liking somebody and having a crush on somebody, these two start to date, and you see Liz go more and more manic as she gets older. But Huey is trying to do everything he can to make sure that Liz doesn't spiral out completely. Once we got to the point where they were pretty much old enough to understand what's actually going on to her, the read became more enjoyable. Like I said, I don't think I would call this book necessarily a romance, just because there was so much emphasis on mental health and trauma and grief, with obviously a little bit of romance that pushed the narrative. But I will say I found this book very important to the overall Boys of Tommen storyline. It clearly is going to come back because we saw that Liz and Gibbsy in the book before have so much beef, and this book explained why she has so much beef with them, and there is a potential for this to get resolved moving forward, but we had to know Liz's backstory in order to understand where she's coming from. So I wouldn't say it's my favorite book in the series. I definitely think it's probably my least favorite in the series, but I did find myself having a soft spot for Huey specifically because he never, ever left her side until she did something completely unforgivable in his eyes, and even still, he was still there for her. So I loved his character a lot, and I'm excited to see more of him moving forward. Overall, I gave this book 3 stars. It wasn't great, it wasn't bad, but reading 400 pages of basically a 5-year-old getting traumatized wasn't necessarily what I was signing up for. I will say that the other books in this series, severe topics, there are instances in which there is some comic relief, and this book just didn't have that. Okay, so this next book was actually a book club read for this month, and I was highly anticipating it. This book actually came out of nowhere. No one was expecting a sequel of Not in Love by Hazelwood, but she just dropped Problematic Romantic Summer out of nowhere and was like, hey, here's a sequel. And so I was like, oh, perfect. I loved Not in Love. I'm going to love this one as well. And when I saw that it was an age gap romance, I was very interested. So in this book, we have Maya Kilgore, who is the sister of Eli, who is the main male character in Not in Love. We have Maya, who's 23, and we have Connor Harkis, who is basically Eli's boss and best friend. He is 38 years old. You see throughout this book that they have this long-lasting, long-distance friendship type situation. Maya made it obviously that she wanted something a little bit more with Connor, and he told her that he can only have a friendship. For almost 3 years, they've had this long-distance friendship where they call each other every single day. They talk for hours and hours a day. Maya can't get herself to date other men because she is so in love with Connor. And Connor, who we kind of found in the first book, was very like standoffish, very much like never going to fall in love. He has a very hard exterior, and it's hard to get into how he's actually feeling. But you see that Connor starts to begin opening up to Maya. He won't do anything about it romantically because he is so obsessed with how much of an age gap they have. He constantly made comments and jokes about how she's a baby, how she's too young for him, and that he could never do anything with her because of how young she is. In the beginning of this book, you see that they are all going to Italy because Eli and Rue, who are the couple from Not in Love, are finally getting married. And as the only family Eli has, Maya is obviously going to be there, and as his best friend, Connor, is also going to be there. You find out that this is the first time they've spoken to each other in 10 months because he completely cut her off. She's obviously hurt by his actions because they were so close and they were best friends. She's trying to get over him, but she's finding that there is nothing she can do to get over her love for Connor. Obviously, throughout this book, there are some scenarios in which they're put in and his patience is tested. From there, they go through a couple problematic situations, and then they are obviously finally end up together. Overall, I felt like this book was okay. We didn't really need a sequel, and this one just felt a lot flat just because I hated the way he treated Maya when he was trying to like stay away from her. I didn't love all of the jokes about how she's not old enough to make her own decisions and that she is basically a baby when she's a full-grown adult, and he would bring that up at every scenario, every situation, which really pissed me off. I will say one of the things that made me the most happy about this book is that we got cameos from other characters from other Ali Hazelwood books. For example, we got a pretty significant cameo between Scarlett and Lucas, who are in her book Deep In, and we also got a few mentions of Jack, who is the main male character in Love Theoretically. I love that all of her books do how she drops her different characters from different books in her new ones, which I think is really interesting and fun. So I was very excited to see those characters again. But overall, I think this book was pretty mid. I gave it 3 stars and didn't have much to say about it, if I'm being honest. And lastly, we have Caught Up by Navessa Allen. Now, if you're not familiar with Navessa Allen, her first book, Lights Out, went completely viral on TikTok, not only because the storyline is like a dark romance, but it has a very comedic tone to it. The Lights Out audiobook went super viral and is very entertaining, I will say. I enjoyed Lights Out a lot. I actually listened to it twice in anticipation of this new book that's coming out. Unfortunately, all of my prep work, this book fell completely flat. In this book, we're following the cousin of the female main character of book 1. His name is Junior. His father is literally a mobster. They are people who work for the mob. So I was very interested to see how this storyline was going to play out because the stakes are higher. We're doing mob work, things like that. You find out that Junior has been in love with our girl Lauren. They had sort of a fling when they were children, and he had to break it off due to threats coming from his father. He still wanted to have her in his life, so he's been lightly stalking her throughout their time apart. When it gets to the point where Junior decides that he no longer wants to work for his father, he starts to take the steps to win Lauren back into his life. Unfortunately, Lauren was the most insufferable character you could ever imagine. She really didn't make it easy for Junior, which is usually like not a bad trait for a groveling situation, which Junior definitely had to do. But I just found her so pick-me. Every time it was her chapter, I just wanted to skip. The only like silver lining in this book was that Teddy Hamilton was the narrator for Junior, which I obviously love him, but unfortunately I just found it very annoying and the romance fell very, very flat. I just felt like realistically Lauren and Junior never would have worked out. Didn't enjoy her at all, as well as her friends being completely insufferable. So I think because of that, I had to give it a 3 stars. And the 3 stars is literally because Teddy Hamilton was the narrator. And the one thing I also found about this book that I didn't really enjoy is that it was very all smut and not enough romance. And I knew going into this that this book was probably going to be a tad smutty, but the way that in Lights Out, there was more romance than smut, I fear. And I think that this was the complete opposite of that. I know I shouldn't be comparing this book to book 1, but because it was so anticipated due to the popularity of book 1, I find myself unable to not compare the two. But I will say I did enjoy the extensive cameos between Allie and Josh, who are the character from book 1. I felt like they had a pretty significant role in helping Junior navigate how to win Lauren back, so I enjoyed seeing them as well, but oof. I don't know if they should have been doing that because Lauren sucked. Well, there you have it. Those are just a few of my thoughts of the new releases that have come out in the past few months. If you've read any of them, I would love to know your thoughts on literally any of the books I just said. I have seen a lot of mixed reviews, especially for the Emily Henry book and Caught Up, so I would love to know your thoughts as well. If you enjoyed this video, please do not forget to like and subscribe if you don't mind. I'll have social media links down below if you want to follow me on TikTok or Instagram. But for now, bye guys!